Welcome back to the Big Weekend Show. New Fox Business polling gives former President Trump a commanding lead in two key 2024 battleground states. Out of the 13 Republican hopefuls, Trump has nearly half of the support from Iowa caucus goers and South Carolina Republican primary voters. And there seems to be a new race for second place. In Iowa, Tim Scott is just 5 points away from Ron DeSantis. And in South Carolina, no surprise here, former Governor Nikki Haley is in second place with 14%. How about the Republican candidate who Politico last week said is about to have a moment? Here's Vivek Ramaswamy on Fox News Sunday.
We are on the rise to win this election, and I am the one candidate in this race who's actually leading us to something, to our vision of what it means to be an American. That is resonating with voters across the country. I began in March at 0.0% in the polls. Look at the national polling averages now. I'm consistently polling at third nationally, and that's ahead of even the first debate when many people in this country haven't yet gotten to know who I am. So I think we're on the same trajectory or ahead of where Donald Trump was in 2015.
Voters also weighing in on the first primary debate that's just 1 month from today. Trump has said he won't attend, but when asked about the message it sends to voters to skip a debate, nearly 60% of Iowa caucus voters say it shows weakness, and about the same number agree in South Carolina. So, Joey, I'm going to begin with you on this primary debate question.
Sure.
Of course, Fox is hosting it, so I obviously have my bias, and some of us do.
Yeah.
But what do you think if you have Iowa caucus voters who say they're supporting the former president, but then also have concerns about a candidate not showing up for the debate?
Yeah, Joey, the voter, wants Donald Trump there for a lot of reasons. I don't know what his answer is on how to get us out of the war in Ukraine. I don't know what his answer is on high interest rates coupled with a ballooning housing market. I don't know what his answer is on things like inflation, because he didn't deal with those things in his presidency. He didn't necessarily inherit those things, and he sure didn't create them while he was president. So he didn't have those issues to deal with. I don't know how he would fix them. I would love to hear him answer that question, see if any of the others have a better answer. With that being said, if this question was asked this way, if a candidate skips a primary debate, this does not apply to Donald Trump, because if they would have asked these same people, if a candidate gets indicted 3 times, is that a sign of weakness or strength? They would have probably said 86% weakness, but Donald Trump got a bump each time. And so these don't apply. The rules don't apply to him the same way.
No, Lisa, Joey's got a really good point there, that you have the rules when it comes to talking to voters and polling voters, but he stands outside of those, and we're seeing that now. But what are your concerns, what this says to the law? Let's say he does become the nominee, because he seems to be headed that way at this particular moment. Then you're talking about a general election, and now you have general election voters out there who've noticed he isn't showing up. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, Donald Trump is sort of this unique political force that cannot be reckoned with, it seems. I mean, he really is. But if I was him, I probably wouldn't go to the debate personally.
Yeah.
As someone who's worked in politics. Yeah. If you're up by that much, why even risk it? So I don't really see the political point for him. I guess my concern, you had made a point about the indictments, has definitely had a rallying fact of Republicans behind him. But I don't know what that means for the general election, because if you look after the New York City indictment, independents actually supported it. The majority of Americans supported it. So I wonder if what we believe as conservatives doesn't add up with the people you need to win a general election. I also worry about that being the sole issue heading into a general election, when people care more about their own circumstances than his. So I do worry about that. But look, if he's the nominee, I'll full-heartedly support him. I think what Vivek has done smartly that the other candidates should do is he's running like he's losing, because he is. And so he's running like he's got nothing to lose. And I think some of the other candidates right now are playing it too safe when they're down by that much. So I think now is the time to be a little bit reckless. And it's okay to make mistakes, make some noise.
And Charlie, as Republicans are trying to figure out exactly how this is going to go, Democrats are watching and wondering and worrying too. And I want to play something, or read something actually, from David Axelrod. He's the former Obama advisor, talking about a possible third-party candidate, saying, quote, "This is going to sneak up on people. I don't know why alarm bells aren't going off now, and they should be at a steady drumbeat from now until the election."
So what David Axelrod is talking about right there is the fact that the Democrats have managed to sort of forestall the great reckoning that is happening, has been happening in the Republican Party for a long time. We saw it with the Tea Party, and then, of course, we saw it with Trump in 2016. Donald Trump was a third-party candidate. He came in, he beat Republicans, took over the Republican Party, and then he went and beat Democrats. He is the third-party candidate that everybody's wanting to talk about now. And Democrats haven't been through that, largely because Democrats run their party with such an iron fist. You can't, they won't, don't let somebody like that. They kill Bernie Sanders in the crib.
Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard. They are so wedded to the party and the system that they don't allow that sort of interloper to get in there. Now, on the polling, so just to finish that, I do think that is a very serious issue for Democrats. And we see it with RFK Jr. and with Cornel West. But the other thing that I think is really interesting here, in South Carolina, so you have Donald Trump at 48, and you have a son and daughter of South Carolina, Tim Scott and Nikki Haley. You combine them, and combined they reach half of Trump's support in South Carolina. The second thing is Ron DeSantis. On April 1, the Real Clear polling average had Trump at 30, DeSantis at 30 and Trump at 45. Fast forward to today, Trump is over 50 in just about all polls, and Ron DeSantis is under 20. And so what we've really seen in the primary over the last couple of months is an incredibly shrinking campaign of a guy that everybody said was going to,
Well, but also it's a little bit of what we saw in 2016. I mean, the anti-Trump faction kept saying, well, Trump can't get more than 30%. Well, you know what? Who else can get 30% when 10 other people are sharing the rest? And so is DeSantis' numbers going down, or are other people getting in the race, and they're not siphoning anything from Trump? And that's the Trump base is there. It's grown. It's not going anywhere. And everyone else is fighting over the rest. And in that scenario, Donald Trump wins.
Although also, I do think it is fair to caveat all of this with that is like a lifetime away in politics.
Right, exactly.
So literally anything can happen. You have candidates coming out that consolidate support.
In the meantime, we're watching them dilute each other a little bit on the Republican side.
Kamala Harris was polling, wasn't she 5th in her home state of California heading into the Iowa caucus? Right, so you got candidates.
If a pollster called me and said, if the election were held today, I would say,
Donald Trump would win.
It's not. Bye. And then hang up.
Bye, Charlie. Okay, very true.
Go away. How'd you get my number?
Straight ahead, the liberal media is already writing off a new series by the creator of Yellowstone as un-American military propaganda. They might want to recruit Jason Aldean.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.